January 1974. A 24-year-old Bruce Springsteen walks into 914 Sound Studios in Blauvelt, New York, carrying the weight of two commercial failures on his shoulders. His debut album, Greetings from Asbury Park, NJ, sold barely 23,000 copies. His second, The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle, did even worse. Critics loved him, called him the next Bob Dylan. But critics don't pay the bills. Record sales do. Columbia Records had made their position crystal clear: one more album. If it doesn't sell, you're dropped. Springsteen was making so little money that he and the E Street Band were barely surviving. "I ain't making that much money," he told an interviewer in January 1974. "I've got some great musicians in my band and I'm paying them terrible money. I pay myself the same, but it's terrible for me too. I mean, we're barely making a living, barely scraping by." The stakes couldn't have been higher. Music was the only thing Springsteen had ever projected himself into. It was everything to him. If this album failed, he was done. And if he was done making music, who was he? What was he? Biographer Peter Ames Carlin would later call it an existential moment for Springsteen. If this didn't work, he was done. Music was the only thing that he had really projected himself into. And the prospect of losing his career was terrifying. But Springsteen had a vision. He wanted to create something massive. Something that would grab you by your throat and insist that you pay attention. Not just to the music, but to life. To being alive. He wanted to make the greatest rock record he'd ever heard. What followed was 14 months of studio hell that nearly broke him. 6 months spent on a single song. Band members quitting mid-sessions. A label losing faith. A manager growing increasingly frustrated. And a perfectionist who couldn't leave any rock unturned. This is the story of how Bruce Springsteen bet everything on one album, and how Born to Run saved the boss. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Bruce Springsteen's. To understand why Born to Run mattered so much, you have to understand just how close Bruce Springsteen was to losing everything. 1973 was supposed to be Bruce Springsteen's year. At least, that's what the critics said. "Never have I been more impressed with a debuting singer," raved the LA Free Press about his debut album. Al Bianculli wrote simply, "73 is Bruce Springsteen's year." John Hammond, the legendary Columbia Records talent scout who had discovered Bob Dylan a decade earlier, had signed Springsteen in June 1972. The audition itself was legendary. Springsteen's manager, Mike Appel, had almost blown the whole thing with his opening remarks. "So you're the man who is supposed to have discovered Bob Dylan. Now, I want to see if you've got any ears, 'cause I've got somebody better than Dylan." Hammond was furious. "Stop, you're making me hate you," he said. But once Springsteen started playing, Hammond knew he had found something special. The problem was, nobody was buying the records. Greetings from Asbury Park, NJ. Moved about 23,000 copies, respectable for a debut, but not spectacular. Critics compared him to Dylan because of his lyrical poeticism and folk rock sound. Songs like Blinded by the Light and For You showcased his storytelling ability. Crawdaddy magazine editor Peter Nobler wrote in March 1973, "He sings with a freshness and urgency I haven't heard since I was rocked by Like a Rolling Stone." But critical acclaim didn't translate to commercial success. In September 1973, his second album, The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle, was released to even more critical praise and even worse sales. The album featured grander songs with an R&B vibe. Tracks like 4th of July, Asbury Park, Sandy, and Incident on 57th Street would become fan favorites. Rosalita, Come Out Tonight, would eventually rank among Springsteen's most beloved concert numbers. But there was very little press, no advertisements in trade papers, no release party. Springsteen's relationship with Columbia was deteriorating. John Hammond and Clive Davis, the two executives who had signed him, were both out of the company by 1974. The new head of A&R was Charles Koppelman, and he had brought another working-class songwriter to Columbia at the same time as Springsteen, Billy Joel. Koppelman heard far more potential in Billy Joel's music than in Bruce Springsteen's. Peter Ames Carlin's biography describes what happened next. After Bruce's second album came out in the fall of 1973 and failed commercially as well, despite having rave reviews, Koppelman essentially said, "You know what, I think we're going to cut bait on this Bruce Springsteen guy. He's just not going anywhere." Fortunately, there were enough advocates at Columbia to stay the hand that was going to cut Bruce loose. But they made it clear, one more album. That's it. The financial reality was brutal. Springsteen wasn't just making no money from record sales. The contracts he'd signed with his manager Mike Appel were disastrously one-sided. He was retaining less than a tenth of his income. The band survived by touring constantly, playing small clubs, mostly in and around New Jersey. By early 1974, Springsteen's back was against the wall. His label wanted to drop him, his manager was growing impatient, his band was exhausted, and he himself was terrified that the only thing he'd ever been good at was about to be taken away from him. Columbia made a suggestion: record in Nashville with session musicians and a brought-in producer. Basically take away Springsteen's artistic control and try to manufacture a hit. Springsteen rejected the idea outright. EPILOGUE successfully negotiated a slightly larger budget, but with a catch. They'd have to record at 914 Sound Studios again, the same place where they'd recorded the first two albums. It wasn't a great studio, but it was affordable. The deal was simple: make an album that sells, or you're done. Springsteen accepted the terms. He had no choice. Late 1973. Bruce Springsteen woke up one morning while on the road in the Mid-South, grabbed his notebook and inked in a title, "Born to Run." The phrase came to him fully formed. He later wrote, "I liked the phrase because it suggested a cinematic drama that I thought would work with the music that I'd been hearing in my head. But having a great title and actually building a song, let alone an entire album around it, would prove to be an entirely different challenge." Springsteen had a specific sonic vision. He wanted to recreate Phil Spector's legendary wall of sound production, the dense layered approach heard on classics like the Ronettes' Be My Baby and Ike and Tina Turner's River Deep Mountain High. He told people he wanted the album to sound like Roy Orbison singing Bob Dylan, produced by Spector. It was an ambitious goal, maybe too ambitious for someone whose label was ready to drop him. Sessions began in January 1974 at 914 Sound Studios. The E Street Band at that time consisted of Clarence Clemons on saxophone, Danny Federici on organ, David Sanchez on piano, Gary Talent on bass, and Ernest Boom Carter on drums. Mike Appel served as co-producer alongside Springsteen. Engineer Louis LaHave returned from the first two albums. The album had several working titles during development, From the Churches to the Jails, The Hungry and the Hunted, War and Roses, and American Summer. But Springsteen's perfectionism immediately slowed progress to a crawl. "I had these enormous ambitions," Springsteen later told Rolling Stone. "I wanted to make the greatest rock record that I'd ever heard. I wanted it to sound enormous, to grab you by your throat and insist that you take that ride. Insist that you pay attention, not just to the music, but to life, to being alive." The title track became an obsession. Most of the songs on Born to Run were written on piano rather than guitar. Springsteen felt it gave him a broader palette to work with. But translating the sounds he heard in his head onto tape proved nearly impossible. Springsteen's perfectionism meant obsessing over every syllable, every note, every texture. His aim for a Phil Spector-type wall of sound production meant multiple instruments were assigned to each track on the studio's 16-track mixing desk. Each new overdub made the recording and mixing more difficult. As he kept rewriting lyrics, Springsteen and Appel created several mixes of Born to Run, containing electric and acoustic guitars, piano, organ, horns, synthesizers, a glockenspiel, strings, and female backing vocalists. There were reportedly 5 different versions of the song. Springsteen would later reveal that the final version had 72 different tracks squeezed onto the 16 tracks of the mixing console, 11 guitar tracks alone, just to get the sound right. The recording process took 6 months for this one song. Mike Appel later told the Asbury Park Press, "It just goes to show you how much is in that record you don't even hear that much of. Because after we did it, we said, we just want a hint of it. That's it." Guitarist Steve Van Zandt, who wasn't yet officially part of the E Street Band but stopped by sessions, later laughed at the madness of it. "Anytime you spend 6 months on a song, there's something not exactly going right. A song should take about 3 hours." But Springsteen couldn't let it go. The original backing track was recorded on May 21, 1974. Vocals were recorded on June 26, 1974. Recording wasn't completed until August 6, 1974, 6 months after sessions began. And here's the kicker. After finally completing the title track, the tapes just sat there, waiting. Because the rest of the album wasn't even close to being done. August 1974, Bruce Springsteen finally had one finished track, Born to Run. Mike Appel, always the hustler, immediately sent Born to Run to Columbia to review for singles potential. The response from the label was devastating. "It's not top 40. Forget it. It's too long." But Appel, in a move that Columbia executives would view as professional misconduct, released a rough mix of the song to a handful of radio stations that had played Springsteen before, including WMMR in Philadelphia, WNEW-FM in New York City, WMMS in Cleveland, WBCN in Boston, and WVBR in Ithaca. On November 3, 1974, Springsteen appeared with DJ Ed Saiki on WMMR in Philadelphia as his special guest. They played the song on the radio, its world premiere. Within a couple of weeks, the song was given to other progressive rock radio outlets across the Northeast. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The stations wanted more. Listeners were calling in requesting the song. At shows, audiences sang along to Born to Run, even though the album wasn't out yet. The stunt generated interest and anticipation. Columbia, seeing the momentum, agreed to fund further sessions. But they made it clear: finish the damn album. The problem was, Springsteen couldn't finish the damn album. By January 1975, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band had been working for over a year with one finished track. Sessions at 914 Sound Studios continued into late October 1974, but they were plagued with problems. The band made attempts at Jungle Land, She's the One, Lovers in the Cold, Backstreets, and So Young and in Love. But faulty equipment and Springsteen's lack of direction halted progress. Music critic Dave Marsh later suggested that Springsteen remained at the subpar 914 studios because recording costs kept building up. Even though superior studios were available, the band felt trapped in a place that couldn't deliver the sound Springsteen wanted. Then, in August 1974, keyboardist David Sanchez and drummer Ernest Boom Carter quit the E Street Band to form their own jazz fusion group called Tone. Born to Run would be Carter's only officially released recording with Springsteen. The departures could have derailed everything. Instead, they brought in two musicians who would define the E Street Band sound for decades, pianist Roy Bittan and drummer Max Weinberg. But even with new blood, the sessions remained a nightmare. Production continued to be plagued by faulty equipment, false starts, and Springsteen's insistence on more takes. The band was exhausted, Appel was frustrated, Columbia was losing patience. Springsteen was drowning. He felt he lacked direction. The sounds in his head refused to materialize on tape. He was struggling to communicate his vision to the band. The recording process turned into something that was wrecking me, just pounding me into the ground, he later admitted. By February 1975, Springsteen knew he needed help. May 22, 1974. Almost a year before Springsteen would hit his breaking point, something happened that would change everything. John Landau was a 27-year-old music critic for Boston's The Real paper and a contributing editor for Rolling Stone. He attended a Bruce Springsteen show at Harvard Square Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Springsteen was opening for Bonnie Raitt. What Landau witnessed that night moved him so profoundly that he wrote what would become one of the most famous concert reviews in rock history. Last Thursday at the Harvard Square Theater, I saw my rock and roll past flash before my eyes. And I saw something else. I saw rock and roll future, and its name is Bruce Springsteen. And on a night when I needed to feel young, he made me feel like I was hearing music for the very first time. The review continued with rapturous praise, calling Springsteen a rock and roll punk, a Latin street poet, a ballet dancer, an actor, a joker, bar band leader, hot shit rhythm guitar player, extraordinary singer, and a truly great rock and roll composer. When Columbia executives saw Landau's rock and roll future quote, they immediately incorporated it into their marketing strategy. Posters went up in record stores featuring the quote. More importantly, Springsteen read the review and felt that Landau understood what he was trying to achieve. The two met in Boston in April 1974 and developed a close friendship. By February 1975, with the Born to Run album stalled and Springsteen feeling lost, he reached out to Landau for help. Landau came to a session and made a simple but crucial observation. The saxophone solo on Wings for Wheels, which would become Thunder Road, should be moved to the end of the song rather than in the middle. Springsteen liked the change. He hired Landau as co-producer of the album. Landau's first major move was relocating the sessions from 914 Studios to the Superior Record Plant in Manhattan. The change of venue immediately improved morale and sound quality. Landau helped Springsteen regain focus with a fresh perspective. Springsteen told Rolling Stone in 1975, "John came up with the idea, let's make a rock and roll record." Things had fallen down internally. Landau brought in engineer Jimmy Iovine, who would eventually become a legendary producer himself and co-founder of Beats Electronics, but at that time was just a talented young engineer at the record plant. The move to better facilities and Landau's guidance began to unlock something in Springsteen. With Roy Bittan and Max Weinberg now solidified in the lineup, and with Landau providing the communication bridge that Springsteen desperately needed, the album finally started to take shape. Sessions resumed at the record plant in April 1975. The band began completing tracks at a faster pace. But even with progress accelerating, the recording process remained grueling. Spring and summer of 1975, the record plant in Manhattan became Bruce Springsteen's world. 10th Avenue Freeze-Out came together as Springsteen's origin story, a song about the formation of the E Street Band. In the third verse, he sang about the big man joined the band, referring to saxophonist Clarence Clemons. The song would later be used to pay tribute to Clemons during concerts after his death in 2011. Thunder Road opened the album with Roy Bittan's delicate piano. The song name-drops Roy Orbison, a huge influence on Springsteen. Like Born to Run, most of the album was composed on piano to access a broader sonic palette. Backstreets went through several rewrites, particularly in the second verse and bridge. Originally called Hiding on the River, Springsteen took lyrical ideas from another song called She's the One to complete it. In fact, She's the One had to be completely reworked after Springsteen cannibalized its lyrics for Backstreets. The album took a four corners approach. Each side started with upbeat songs about escape and adventure and ended with songs about loss and betrayal. As sessions progressed, Steve Van Zandt, though not yet officially in the E Street Band, contributed crucial ideas. One day Van Zandt stopped by the studio and saw that horn charts written by Bittan weren't working. Van Zandt figured out how to properly give 10th Avenue Freeze-Out a Stax-inspired groove. He was subsequently asked to join the E Street Band. The closer, Jungle Land, became an epic 9-minute, 36-second track featuring one of the most famous saxophone solos in rock history. But it was torture to record. On the very last day of sessions, July 20th, 1975, Springsteen and Clarence Clemons spent 16 hours going note by note until Bruce finally felt satisfied with the solo. "That was a nightmare," Landau told the New York Times. "He had a vision in his head, and the only way he could work it out was through a certain amount of trial and error with Clarence, and he was in a very obsessive endgame on the album." The mixing itself was a technical marvel. When Jimmy Iovine mixed Doo-Wop, That Thing, at Sony Studios, it required 128 tracks, two 48-track machines plus two 24-inch 2-track machines, all running simultaneously. But even after 14 months of recording, 6 months spent on the title track alone, countless rewrites and remixes, Springsteen still wasn't satisfied. Right after sessions wrapped, Columbia brought down a reel-to-reel of the finished mix for Springsteen and the band to hear. As the music played, the album they'd all just spent over a year of their lives creating, Springsteen suddenly heard everything that was wrong with it. He started lashing out at everyone. "Oh geez, there's the saxophone. That's a cliché." All he could sense was the distance between what he was hearing and what he imagined should be on the vinyl. The next day, engineer Jimmy Iovine came from New York with an acetate of the mastered version. What would actually be cut into vinyl? They played it. Springsteen freaked out. He grabbed the acetate, stormed back to the hotel, and hurled it into the deep end of the swimming pool. "We're not putting this out," he said. "We are going to scrap this. We are going to start over again. We're going to re-record all these songs when we play the Bottom Line in a couple weeks. Just re-record the whole album live in front of an audience because that's where we're at our best anyway." But Columbia had already cranked up the promotional machinery. The album had to come out at the end of the summer. The marketing campaign was already in motion. Bruce's impulse was pure panic. As he later told NPR, "The album made me feel itchy on the inside and the outside." But there was no time. The album was going out, whether Bruce Springsteen liked it or not. At 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning on July 20th, 1975, immediately after finishing Jungle Land, the band rolled out of the studio, got in a van, and drove up to Providence to begin a tour. The album was done. Now it was time to find out if 14 months of hell had been worth it. August 25th, 1975, Born to Run hit stores. Columbia Records had accompanied the release with a massive $250,000 promotional campaign directed at both consumers and the music industry. They spent $40,000 on advertisements utilizing John Landau's famous "rock and roll future" quote from his concert review. The marketing blitz worked. Pre-orders for Born to Run were upwards of 350,000 units, more than twice the combined sales of Springsteen's first two albums. The album peaked at number 3 on the Billboard Top LPs and Tape chart. The title track became Springsteen's first top 40 hit, peaking at number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100. Critics who had championed Springsteen from the beginning felt vindicated. Rolling Stone gave it rave reviews. Even mainstream publications that typically ignored rock music couldn't ignore this. But the real breakthrough came 2 months later. October 27, 1975. Bruce Springsteen made history by becoming the first rock star to appear on the covers of Time and Newsweek in the same week. The dual covers weren't a coincidence. According to Peter Ames Carlin's biography, when Time's Jay Cox found out that Newsweek's Maureen Orth was doing a piece on Springsteen, he convinced his editor that they were about to be scooped by their chief competitor. Both magazines rushed to get their stories completed. The two articles, while featuring similar details, had strikingly different tones. Time's piece, Rock's New Sensation, was written by Cox, a big Springsteen fan. It heaped praise on the new star, calling him street smart but sentimental, with the wild on-stage energy of a pinball rebounding off invisible flippers. The article predicted that everybody is going to know where he's coming from and just where he's heading. Newsweek's article, The Making of a Rock Star, took a more cynical angle. It looked at Columbia Records' marketing campaign and concluded, hypes are as American as Coca-Cola, so perhaps, in one way or another, Bruce Springsteen is the real thing. The Newsweek article questioned whether the success was due to Springsteen's talent or Columbia's promotional machinery, what Joni Mitchell had called the star-maker machinery behind the popular song. Springsteen himself was uncomfortable with all the attention. He told Time, "I don't understand what all the commotion is about. I feel like I'm on the outside of all this, even though I'm on the inside. It's like you want attention, but sometimes you can't relate to it." To Newsweek he said, "What phenomenon? We ain't no phenomenon. The hype just gets in the way." Despite his discomfort, the dual covers cemented Springsteen's position as a cultural phenomenon. Mr. and Mrs. America, the folks in dentist offices in Dubuque and supermarket lines in Topeka, now knew who Bruce Springsteen was. Max Weinberg, who had only joined the E Street Band a year earlier, recalls the moment vividly. "There aren't superlatives you can utilize to tell you what kind of feeling it was to see those covers." Even Springsteen's father, who would later inspire the autobiographical song Adam Raised a Cain, had a reaction. Weinberg reports that he said, "Better you than another picture of the president." Nixon was going through Watergate at the time. The album went on to sell more than 6 million copies in the United States alone. Born to Run wasn't certified platinum until 1986, but its cultural impact was immediate and lasting. Bruce Springsteen had done it. He'd saved his career. He'd created a masterpiece. He'd proved everyone wrong, or so it seemed. Just when Bruce Springsteen should have been celebrating his triumph, everything fell apart. The problem was buried in those contracts Springsteen had signed with Mike Appel back in 1972. Contracts he'd signed because he was desperate to make music and didn't care about the business side. In early 1976, Springsteen recruited John Landau to look over his contracts. Landau immediately recommended calling a lawyer. What the lawyers discovered was shocking. Springsteen was retaining less than a tenth of his income. The 3 contracts, for publishing, recording, and management, that bound Springsteen to Appel's Laurel Canyon Productions were extraordinarily one-sided. Apple had structured the deal so that he received massive percentages of everything Springsteen earned. Mike's idol was Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's legendary manager. But as Springsteen noted in his autobiography, "I loved Elvis and it was a fun conceit for the two of us, but I wasn't going to be Elvis. Those days were gone. I was intentionally trying to not be Elvis." With the help of the law firm of Mayer, Nussbaum and Katz, Springsteen prepared to renegotiate. But Appel refused to budge on the terms. On July 27, 1976, less than a year after Born to Run made Springsteen a star, he filed a lawsuit against Laurel Canyon Ltd. The allegations included fraud, undue influence, and breach of trust. Mike Appel struck back 2 days later. He filed a countersuit seeking a permanent injunction to ban Springsteen from entering a recording studio with John Landau. On September 15, 1976, Judge Arnold Fine granted Appel's request. Bruce Springsteen was prohibited from recording any new music until the lawsuit was settled. The ruling was devastating. Springsteen had planned to begin recording his 4th album in June 1976. Instead, he was legally barred from the studio. Ever since the issuance of the court's preliminary injunction order, Springsteen stated in an affidavit, "I have started countless numbers of songs which I have been unable to develop to their potential for lack of a proper recording opportunity. Many of these songs will never be finished." With no income from new recordings and mounting legal bills, Springsteen did the only thing he could. He went back on tour. What became known as the Lawsuit Tour kicked off on September 26, 1976, at the Arizona Veterans Memorial Coliseum. The tour lasted through March 25, 1977, with the band crisscrossing the U.S. and Canada. They played their first arena shows ever, including back-to-back performances at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. "People thought we were gone. Finished," Springsteen later explained. "They just thought Born to Run had been a record company creation. We had to reprove our viability on a nightly basis by playing, and it took many years." Though thousands of fans turned out to see him, Springsteen was in a dark place mentally. The legal battle was about more than money. It was about control of his art, his career, his life. The lawsuit dragged on for 10 months. May 28, 1977, at 3 a.m., after 10 months of legal battles, Bruce Springsteen and Mike Appel finally reached a settlement. Details of the agreement were kept confidential. but the broad strokes eventually emerged. Appel gave up most of his publishing rights in exchange for approximately $800,000. His production cut was reduced from 6% to 2%. He would continue to receive some proceeds from Springsteen's first 3 albums, but he would no longer administer them. Appel's attorney called the settlement a complete victory for Appel, but in reality both sides had lost. Springsteen lost over a year of his career, crucial momentum following Born to Run. Appel lost his most valuable client and any future earnings from Springsteen's work. Despite the bitterness of the legal battle, Springsteen would later write about Appel with surprising tenderness in his 2016 autobiography. A settlement was reached, separation papers were drawn up, and one quiet night in a dimmed Midtown office building, Mike and I finalized our divorce. I would have some dealings with Mike in the future, some good, some cheesy. But once the war was over and time, a good deal of it, passed, the fondness and connection remained. We had come to cross purposes. This is the world, but I can never hate Mike, I can only love him. In a remarkable gesture, when Appel started a new agency a decade later, Springsteen loaned him $175,000 to do it. These were two people who were essentially married, who had broken down walls for each other and together. David Benjamin, part of Springsteen's legal team, told Peter Ames Carlin. John Landau officially became Springsteen's manager in May 1977, almost exactly 3 years after he'd proclaimed Springsteen the rock and roll future in his concert review. Their professional relationship continues to this day, nearly 50 years later. 3 days after the settlement, on June 1, 1977, Bruce Springsteen entered the recording studio with John Landau, the E Street Band, and engineer Jimmy Iovine. He was finally free to make music again. The album that came next, Darkness on the Edge of Town, was darker, more mature, and more personal than Born to Run. Released in 1978, it was heralded by critics as proof that Springsteen wasn't just a product of hype. He was the real deal. But it was Born to Run that changed everything. The album proved that rock music could be cinematic, layered, and emotionally complex while remaining accessible. It showed that perfectionism in the studio, however maddening, could produce something transcendent. In 2003, Born to Run was added to the National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress, recognizing it as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. The album ranked number 18 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. The influence spread across generations. Listen to U2's anthemic production on the Joshua Tree. You hear Born to Run? Listen to Arcade Fire's sweeping orchestrations. You hear it there too. Listen to The Killers, The War on Drugs, Gaslight Anthem. All of them owe a debt to that wall of sound Springsteen built in 1975. Jimmy Iovine, who engineered the album, went on to become one of the most powerful figures in music. He produced albums for Tom Petty, Stevie Nicks, and U2. He co-founded Interscope Records and later Beats Electronics, which sold to Apple for $3 billion. But he traces his career breakthrough to those sessions at the record plant with a desperate 25-year-old from New Jersey. John Landau became one of the most successful managers in rock history, guiding Springsteen's career for nearly 5 decades. Their partnership became a model for artist-manager relationships, built on trust, shared vision, and genuine friendship. The E Street Band became legendary in their own right. Max Weinberg would later become the bandleader for Conan O'Brien's Late Night Show. Roy Bittan would play on albums for Bob Seger, Meat Loaf, and Dire Straits. Clarence Clemons became an icon, his friendship with Springsteen symbolizing unity across racial lines. Mike Appel, despite the bitter lawsuit, eventually reconciled with Springsteen. In interviews decades later, Appel spoke with pride about discovering and nurturing Springsteen's talent. The two men made peace with their complicated history. The album's commercial success gave Springsteen the leverage to make music on his own terms for the rest of his career. He never had to compromise his artistic vision again. He could spend as long as he needed in the studio. He could write whatever songs he wanted. He was free. That freedom produced The River, Nebraska, Born in the USA, Tunnel of Love, and decades of work that cemented his status as one of America's greatest songwriters. But none of it would have happened without that desperate gamble in 1974. Without those 6 months spent on one song. Without that 14-month marathon that nearly broke him. Born to Run didn't just save Bruce Springsteen's career, it created the boss. The story of Born to Run is the story of an artist who refused to compromise even when it nearly destroyed him. Bruce Springsteen could have taken Columbia's advice and recorded in Nashville with session musicians. He could have accepted good enough after 3 months instead of pushing for perfect after 14 months. He could have released Born to Run, the single, and moved on without obsessing over every note of the album. He didn't. Instead, he spent 6 months on one song. He squeezed 72 tracks onto 16. He spent 16 hours getting one saxophone solo right. He threw an acetate into a swimming pool because it didn't match the sound in his head. That level of obsession is often called crazy. But sometimes crazy is the only path to greatness. The lawsuit with Mike Appel revealed an ugly truth about the music industry. Young artists desperate for a shot will sign anything. Springsteen's story became a cautionary tale, leading future musicians to read their contracts more carefully, to understand what they were giving away before it was too late. But the larger lesson of Born to Run is about belief. Belief in yourself when nobody else does. Belief in your vision when the label calls it uncommercial. Belief that your art matters even when you're broke and exhausted and ready to quit. In January 1974, Bruce Springsteen was 24 years old, 2 albums deep into failure and facing the end of his dream. Columbia Records wanted to drop him. His manager was frustrated, his band was barely surviving. 14 months later, he was on the cover of Time and Newsweek in the same week, hailed as the future of rock and roll. That transformation didn't happen because of hype or marketing or luck. It happened because one stubborn kid from New Jersey spent 14 months locked in a studio, refusing to settle for anything less than the greatest rock record he'd ever heard. And he made it. Born to Run sold over 6 million copies in the United States. It launched a career that has spanned 5 decades and produced 21 studio albums. It proved that commercial success and artistic integrity aren't mutually exclusive. Most importantly, it saved Bruce Springsteen from becoming a what-if story. Another talented kid who almost made it but ran out of chances. Instead, he became the boss. That 24-year-old who walked into 914 Sound Studios in January 1974, terrified that this was his last shot, created one of the most iconic albums in rock history. An album that still sounds urgent and alive nearly 50 years later. An album that makes you want to roll down the windows, turn up the volume, and drive. Because that's what Born to Run has always been about. Escape, freedom, and the belief that somewhere down that highway, there's something better waiting. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And Bruce Springsteen's story is that sometimes when you're desperate enough, crazy enough, and stubborn enough to spend 6 months on one song, you create something that lasts forever.